Hello and welcome to the Byte Pod. My name is Anne Ritho and I'm the Director of Data Science on the Byte team, and I'm filling in for Eric Hamilton as today's host. Our speakers today are Byte COO and former Special Agent with Homeland Security Investigations and investigative subject matter expert Tim Gilday, and our special guest David Albright. David has an impressive background. He's a physicist and is the founder and president of the nonprofit, the Institute for Science and International Security in Washington, D.C. Welcome to both of you. Before we move to our speakers, I want to briefly talk about the Byte platform. Byte is two things. It's an AI-based trade data platform with hundreds of millions of records that informs our analysis and drives our compliance and risk management tools. We share investigative analytics and deep dive reports on our website, and we also take the output of that AI model, consolidate the larger list of compliance data, and make it all available to the public through a very easy-to-use web app. So the second thing that Byte does is it's a web app. We offer a cost-effective toolbox for trade and transaction compliance, and this is an efficient way for customers to mitigate their trade risk. Now I will turn it over to Tim to do further introduction of David and let the two of you discuss counterproliferation and drones in the supply chain.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome, David. We're going to talk today about strategic trade controls and a particular problem set in dealing with drones and their components. That has always been an important area for counterproliferation, but since the invasion of Ukraine, it has become even more critical. And what we're going to do with David today is walk through a use case and see what we can determine as far as sourcing the components critical for drone manufacturing. Where are the gaps in enforcement, and how can different types of analytic approaches maybe help close those gaps and loopholes to prevent those components from going to the wrong places. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Okay, thank you very much. When Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the things it quickly realized was that its military-industrial production infrastructure was really inadequate, and they made certain decisions to try to internalize the ability to make certain weapon systems. And what I'd like to talk about today is the Russian effort to learn how to make a particular type of drone. It's a kamikaze drone, and it's a drone that they went to Iran to both buy the drones and learn from Iran how to make them, and have been using this drone very effectively on the battlefield to terrorize Ukrainians, destroy civilian infrastructure. Last winter, they were very important in knocking out much of Ukraine's ability to produce electricity and heat in the cold winter months. And it's starting again, where these drones are playing a very important role. It's not the only drone Russia's building, and may talk about some of those during the course of this talk. But I think to get to the supply chain, I think it makes sense to focus on the Shahed 136, because at my institute, we've been able to gather a considerable set of internal documents to the factory that makes these things. It's called JSC Alabuga. It's actually a special economic zone in Tatarstan, Russia. And historically, it's been civilian in nature, but with the war, it started to turn to military production and settled on making of these Shahed 136 drones. And they signed a contract to make what they call the Geron 2, and it is this Shahed 136 from Iran. And it has this delta wing, and it's propeller driven, and it can have a warhead weight of about 40 to 50 kilograms and a range of over 1,000 kilometers. And it sounds like a lawnmower when it's going overhead, according to people in Ukraine. But if it hits, it's quite deadly. Now, the contract with Albright is to build 6,000 of these Shahed 136, um, and it's a fairly expensive contract. It's each drone is costing Albright about $70,000, and there's also other costs associated with making it. For example, getting the required parts, or earlier the disassembled drones to Russia from Iran, and that's been involving millions of dollars more. Now, what Albright did, and this is actually represents some fairly smart industrial policy, is to try to take what Iran has to offer and Russify it, um, in the sense, fit it to the Russian industrial model, and go out and buy the machine tools you need, furnaces, other kinds of equipment, get the raw materials, learn how to make all these components that go into the Shahed. And I'll talk about some of those a little later. Um, and as they're doing that, they in a three-step process. They were first buying disassembled drones. This happened in the first half of 2023, where they would buy import about 100 Shahed 136 drones per month. That phase is over, and in that 6 months period, Albright learned to make the airframe of the drone, the outer shell, and then would start making those. And while they're importing the guts of the drones, the engines, the electronic components, the propeller, the warhead, and that would all be shipped from Iran to Russia. And in this period that's continued to today and will extend even further into 2024, Albright was buying machine tools and other things and installing them in their factory in this special economic zone. It's two large industrial buildings in this zone, and we're not quite sure where they are right now. These plans were in the documents that we possess that were written in early 2023, and we've tried to kind of keep in touch in certain ways. And our understanding is they are able to move toward indigenization in the first part of 2024, and that's in the yellow part of this graph, where they'll be at the rate of about 220 drones a month, be marching steadily to meet their contract to build 6,000 by roughly by September of 2025. And this is terrifying for Iran because while the Ukrainians have learned to shoot down many of them, Russia will send in 50 to 100, and it can actually do that now. And a significant fraction will get through, and they cause quite a bit of damage when they do. Now, in terms of the supply chain, one of the surprises for us as we looked into this, and we've depended on the internal documents, but also what Ukraine was finding in the drones that were downed or crashed, was a remarkable amount of Western components in the various units of major components of the drone, and particularly a lot of U.S. electronics components. And I'd like to focus on what we call the electronic modules in the Shahed 136 drones. And if you look in the media or hear things in the media, you hear the usual kinds of things you'd expect with a drone. I mean, it could have a GPS system, it could have an inertial navigation system, and that's in a module called Sadr. This is an Iranian designed, and until today probably Iranian supplied module. You have the flight control unit, the FCU. That's often discussed by even the Ukrainians. They'll find parts that represent or from the flight control unit. You have the power distribution unit. You have the air data module, which is looking at information collected on the wing to judge the airspeed and various other factors you need to pilot the drone. The surprise was in what's called NASR, and 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 what it is it's the anti-jamming unit, and Ukraine has been suffering in being able to jam the the drones, and it's not just the Shahed 136; it applies across a whole range of Russian drones. And what you have in NASR is, at least according to our expert on electronics and these kinds of systems, is a state of the art anti-jamming system, which is in a sense, in a brute force way, overcoming the efforts by Ukraine to jam it. And so Ukraine has not demonstrated a good ability to bring these things down, or in a sense get them to circle aimlessly through jamming the satellite signal. They're able um, to have a system in place that that is designed in Iran. We assumed it's reverse engineered from some kind of captured drone. Could be U.S., could be Israeli. It's a very remarkable system, and particularly it's a system that uses a tremendous amount of U.S. electronics. Um, there's microcontrollers from Texas Instruments. There's transceivers, the antennas from Marvel and Analog Devices. Um, you have field programmable gate arrays, which are critical to NASR to enable to do the kind of calculations that the drone has to do to in a sense, make sure that the GPS signal is received at the drone despite the jamming. And so if I look at it in another way, in this slide, um, the in a way I've covered all this, but what you have um, is a devotion to the anti-jamming system of NASR, and it's been very attractive to the Russians. And in this slide, the REB means electromagnetic systems. It's a Russian acronym. I mean, I should have mentioned this. All the slides from Alabuga are in Russian, and we've translated them. And here is another. This is actually a slide from another PowerPoint presentation, but you have a system that is able to essentially get through the air defenses of the Ukrainians. Now, here's a graph or a bar chart showing we took all the parts, components, and we have a complete list of the components in these 5 or so electronic modules. And there's components, and then there's also connectors, wires and connectors. They're not tightly controlled, but they're very important. And there's about 140 of them that are in the list for the Shahed 136. And the list was developed by Alabuga staff based on Iranian supplied lists of the components in these electronic modules. And Russia, again, wants to be able to go out and acquire these components on their own and build the modules themselves, not depend on buying them from the Iranians. And what you see in this bar graph is just the numbers of components from various manufacturers. So the most are from Texas Instrument, 34. The next highest bar is really the connectors. And that's from a company which is both U.S. and French. You have the next one is Analog Devices, which is a company up in Massachusetts. You have Maxim, you have Maxwell, you have a whole range of companies. The one providing the field programmable gate array is X, or I'm not saying it right, Xilinx, and there can be other suppliers for these. There is a program in Alabuga that if they can't get one component, they'll try to get an analog component. But there are some components that doesn't apply for. There's a Texas Instrument component that the Russians and Alabuga staff talk about quite a bit, made by Texas Instrument, that appears to be unique and it's a microprocessor. There are 7 of them are used in each Shahed 136, and at least according to the Alabuga people, they cannot find an analog to that part. They need to get that Texas Instrument part. And there's other cases where there are certain components that just aren't made by very many companies in the world. And those companies are typically in the United States, some few in Europe, maybe one or so in Japan, but they're not. These aren't the kind of components that are made by a great many companies. Here's another way to look at it, just a ring diagram giving the percentage of parts where you have, essentially, if we count the connectors, we call them here France/US. It's the Alabuga people typically consider them in their narratives as US, but so you have, what, 80% or no, yeah, about 80% of the parts are coming from the United States. Maybe 5% from the Netherlands. Netherlands is another place where there's very important component manufacturing companies, and also facilities that make the machine tools necessary to make the very sophisticated electronic components. And then there's a smattering of other companies. China provides some, and on and on and on. Russia, interestingly, provides very few, and some of the and typical component from Russia is very low tech. A relay, for example, I mean, it's a very low tech component, and that really is what you're faced with. Is that if Russia had to build this on its own, it simply could not build the Shahed 136 or most of the other drones it's using. It depends extensively on foreign procurement. Now, what do you do? As we research this, we run into the obvious problem that big companies like Texas Instrument, ST, Analog Devices sell many of their components through distributors, DigiKey, Mauser. There's a lot of them, and many are in China, and you don't have. And we queried one company, I don't want to mention its name, it told us that 40% of its sales are through distributors. And the distributors claim they're doing due diligence, but we tested that in the sense of going to buy things, and there's essentially no due diligence done. And if you, obviously, if you're in Europe, where I'm located now, there's a great deal of effort to try to reduce sales to Russia, prosecutions, trying to weed out networks of individuals and their associates who are selling illegally. But and you can make progress. But when you look at China and you look at some of the trade data, vast amounts of Texas Instrument components have been moving from China to Russia. And you can look at other companies and find the same thing. And so when you talk about China, you have distributors who aren't doing due diligence, and you have a country that is somewhat sympathetic to Russia and historically has had very poor trade control enforcement. So it's a kind of a perfect storm for being a place where U.S. interests and controls are bypassed. Now, it's not the only one. There's a whole range of transshipment countries that come into play, but the fundamental problem when you're talking about the Shahed 136 and its electronic components is that U.S. components are moving out into the world to distributors, and those distributors, many of whom are in China, are not doing due diligence, and that means those components are getting to Russia. Now, what do you do about it? Certainly, there's been some companies that also have parts in these drones, servo motors, miniaturized servo motors. Russia can't make them. China can barely make them. And a company called High-Tech made the decision that it would, at least for some of its servo motors, simply not sell them through distributors, would not sell them at all into China because they couldn't do any due diligence or expect the distributors to do due diligence, and bring back the item to their own company for sale directly, and then try to exercise much greater due diligence. We're hoping and recommending that companies like Texas Instrument, Analog Devices will do that for the certain key components that have been identified in the documents, like the ones produced in Alabuga, where you even see the Russians. And this, when I say Russians, I mean it broadly. It was Alabuga people, but it was also the Ministry of Defense people saying, really challenging Alabuga at different times. How are you going to get this Texas Instrument part? Without it, you can't run a Shahed 136 drone. And so they worry about the supply chain a great deal. And we think that if Texas Instruments and some others would limit the sale of these critical components, that could start to have an impact on the ability of Russia to field certain parts of its military systems, particularly those aimed at defeating the jamming systems of the Ukrainians.
So that's very helpful, David. Particularly the deep dive into the actual components and patterns and trade associated with drones. One thing I'd like to mention, just from a policy perspective, as you know, the EU and the United States have implemented the high priority battlefield items that identify those microprocessors and some other components. So they're creating special controls to identify those types of commodities. Also, our team has correlated those drone parts, those high priority battlefield items as well, and other types of weapons and equipment critical for Russia and the Ukraine. We have created filters in our Byte platform, which can be used to quickly identify whether any of the commodities companies are trading with are associated with those end uses. So that's available, and we continue to develop these filters in our engagements with experts like yourself. But this is very helpful for our participants to understand the actual nuts and bolts of how drones are manufactured, how much these companies rely on Western companies. And this is very helpful. Thank you.
I'm happy to do it. And I would just say one last word, that part of the struggle is to get the due diligence back into American and American allies' hands, because that's where you find the most responsible players in this whole supply chain, um, and that if they can wrestle control back, I think that can lead to making it much harder for Russia to field some of these systems. And I think the Byte platform can help these companies have the tools to be able to do that.
Right. And this is all part of that shared responsibility between the enforcement agencies in the U.S. and the private sector. The government can't go out and stop and look at all these shipments. The volume of trade is much too high. So there is a partnership with responsible companies in the commercial sector. And this type of tool will support that without imposing burdens, or it'll certainly lower the compliance burdens on these companies, because this Byte risk management tool is fully automated and it's at a very low cost. So companies that take their shared responsibility seriously have a solution here where they can do their trade, facilitate the legitimate business, but identify those high risk shipments that you have gone through today. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you both. And just to echo what you're both saying, we do have a few blogs on our website that are about items going into Russia. So just to continue the conversation there, you can check it out at bytedata.io. Thank you so much for your time today, David, and to Tim as well. And if anyone would like a free trial of Byte, you can visit the website or email us at byte at newborders.com and sign up for your free trial today.